Hi friends, my name is Angela and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today is quite a unique video which, judging by the title, you may think you don't have an interest in, but I would encourage you to hang around. In my June 2024 reading wrap-up, I shared with you that my father passed away that month. And it was a sudden thing that happened, and if you want to know more about it, please go back and check that video. But it's now been 12 months since that devastating moment in my life, and so many of you shared with me that you were also going through some grieving and mourning of your own following other family members passing. Even some people reached out and said that their parent had passed away a long time ago and they were still processing it. And like many of you, when I have trouble in my life, I turn to books for comfort and for information. It's not just that I want to escape what might be happening, but I want to get answers. And I look for shared experiences and perspectives and just the acknowledgement that other people have gone through what I'm going through, whatever it might have been, and how people found their way through and out of a difficult situation. So today I wanted to share with you a small selection of books that I feel have helped me process my grief, and I think that they will be interesting for anyone who has gone through a grieving process, mourned someone that they loved that was close to them, but also for anybody who wants to be a better friend and to be able to give advice and wisdom to people that might go through this. So today I wanted to go through a small selection of books that I read over the past year and some beforehand that I feel really gave me some tools to help me work through my grief, in case you are going through something similar, or to help you support someone else who is going through something similar. Grieving is all about those internal feelings and emotions that we are processing in a response to loss. And being able to provide you, or for you to be able to provide someone else, a book that puts words to those feelings, I feel is one of the greatest gifts you can give. Personally, I felt it really encouraging and comforting when I would read a book and the author would write something that kind of put words to something I had experienced, but I hadn't been able to articulate myself. That was very, very comforting. Even when I read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is not on this list, but it is a large portion of that book is about Hamnet's mother and father grieving the loss of him. And it is a little bit different. It's about parents losing a child, but it gave me these little nuggets, these little delicate moments of truth as I read how Hamnet's mother grieved for him and how she felt, and it really, really was quite touching. So most of these books are non-fiction. There is one fiction book in here. It's not all doom and gloom, and I don't want you to not watch this because you think it's going to be all sad and soppy. But I want you to be able to come out of this with some books that maybe you would like to read, something that you might like to recommend to someone else. The first book I wanted to discuss is The End of Your Life book club by, I think it's Will Schwalbe. And this I read over 10 years ago, and it might have been the start of this very niche genre that I didn't realize I was reading. And it's a memoir about a mother and son who form a two-person book club as the mother is coming towards the end of her life. The book starts with Will's mother, who's starting to receive chemotherapy treatment, and he just asks her casually, what have you read lately? It's what they've always done together. They've had this bond over reading. And it's a conversation they've had time and time again, but this time it kind of started this new tradition for them. They would start to read the same books and have this conversation while she's having her treatment about the books they've read and discussing them. And it wasn't just about discussing the books, but it's about discussing something other than her sickness. I think it was a real example of the power of reading in our lives, and it's a really moving relationship between a mother and a son, and how books are not just a single person experience. Books connect us to other people as well. This book will always come to my mind because I went through quite a few personal things at the time I read it. Just a short while after I read this book, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I also believe that this diagnosis I received, when I try and think back on the timeline, it was either just before or just after my best friend from school was diagnosed with breast cancer. We were both in our late 30s at this time, and we kind of rebonded over this shared experience we were going through. My story was very, very different to hers, and unfortunately she lost her battle with cancer. And this book just haunted me for such a long time. And I have a clean bill of health in terms of my experience as well, which I am eternally grateful for. but this book really did come to me at the right moment in my life, if that makes sense. I would recommend it to book lovers. It's not an overly sad book. I would recommend it to anyone that loves books. There's interesting conversations around different types of books, classics, new releases at the time, but also to those who are dealing with a serious illness of a loved one. I think it would be a really interesting book for you to read to understand the perspective of someone who is going through that. My next recommendation is Wintering by Katherine May. I read this book years ago, and when I read it, it wasn't coming from a perspective of grief or mourning, but I found it to be a really comforting message through tough times. The author shares her own story of how her life was thrown off course when her husband became seriously ill. She had health challenges that meant she had to give up her demanding job. And she uses the idea of wintering as this metaphor for times in your life that maybe are cold, still, and uncertain, whether it's due to illness, loss of a person, loss of a thing, heartbreak, or even just burnout. I really like this book because she weaves in elements of literature and mythology and different cultures from around the world to show that these difficult and quiet seasons that we go through are necessary. Having read this book, I felt like I was kind of given the permission when I needed it later in life through different situations to just kind of say, no, I need to retreat. I need to withdraw. I need to just winter through this moment, to trust that like the seasons, our lives move in cycles. It's not a perfect book. I think a lot of people have comments around the privilege of her perspective. But from my perspective, the idea that we don't always have to push forward, that we can retreat when we need to gather our strength, that really stayed with me. And even years later, that message really does still resonate. H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald. This is a specific book about grieving. I read this book last year. I picked it up a few months after my dad had passed, and I knew this was going to be a challenge because this book is about Helen's journey as she processes her loss of her father while raising and training a goshawk. And the reason I recommend this book is because the way it flows from Helen's grieving process about this sudden loss that she's experienced to the intense focus that she has training her goshawk to then reflecting on the life of another author called T.S. White, who was a falconer and an author. Each element of this book is engaging. It is most beautifully written. It was up there in my top 10 books of 2024. I'd say it's in my top 5 for 2024. The nature writing in here is really lovely, and it gives such a beautiful relief for those hard internal conversations Helen was having with herself around the loss of her father. It gives you a break from it, so it doesn't feel like you're just reading a book about death. I think it's probably going to be a classic in years to come, not just from the memoir, but from her nature writing. I think it's going to become a classic from that perspective. And it will really just hold your heart really gently as you go through this year with Helen. I do recommend it if you have lost someone, that this is a beautiful book for that. Be gentle with yourself, like with all of these recommendations, only you know if you're ready to read these sort of things, but this one was a really healing moment for me. The Well-Gardened Mind by Sue Stuart-Smith. This is a book where Sue explores quite a deep connection between gardening and nature and good mental health in everyday life. It's often described as a book for people who are looking to improve on their mental well-being, and it is most definitely that. It is quite dense. I felt like it was a bit of a reference book at times. It's perhaps not a light book, but each chapter starts as a personal story from Sue and her own garden and her home, and then it leads into different elements like the role of green spaces in hospitals, prisons, even on the front lines of war. For me, it really helped me understand how nature is so healing for us, for our mental health, for our physical health as well. And tending to a garden really supports that. And over the last few years, my garden was not tended to very well because of so much stuff going on in my personal life. And I feel like the garden was a direct reflection of my mind. And now there's a little bit more order in my garden and my mind. It helped me understand how much being in nature and gardening nourishes your mental health, protects your mental health. There's something, I think there was a passage in here about how gardeners can accept death more readily than others, because when you're a gardener, you see things die all the time. You know that a tomato plant is not going to survive year after year after year. It'll go through its season, it'll die, and that's the cycle of a garden. And no matter how much you want to, you cannot avoid that fact. Things are going to die in your garden. And it's a hard reality, but it is quite a grounding and healing knowledge as well. And she discusses about how gardeners are just able to process death and loss in a different way than people who aren't gardeners. If you want to dive further into the connection between a positive mindset, good mental well-being, and gardening, I thoroughly recommend this book. Like I said, it is a bit dense, but it's well worth persevering. The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. You are hard-pressed to find any list of books that are recommended for people that are grieving and not see this on that list. And I think part of it is because it is one of the few books specifically about the grieving process that doesn't bring religion into the fact. You don't have to be a believer to read this book and receive comfort from it, whereas a lot of other books do have that religious aspect. I actually only read this a couple of months ago, and it is a very, very personal account from Joan Didion as she processes the year following her husband's sudden death. And having read it, I do have to agree that it is one of the most solid, specific books about the grieving process that I have read. Joan Didion she can sometimes have a bit of a stream of consciousness, but I found that a little bit soothing because we go through that ourselves. You think this one thing and leads to another thing, and I could see that through her writing. And all of a sudden, as you're reading through it, something will click and you will understand and you have complete empathy for that thing that she is talking about because you are experiencing it yourself, even though you may not have put words to it yet. Grieving is such a personal experience, but it is a universal experience. Everybody will go through it, yet we process it so differently. And Didion has a way of looking at something from a different angle that helps you just put words to an experience. It's not a perfect book. There is moments where it is relatable and then it's not relatable, moments where there's poignancy and then it's very not poignant because of Joan Didion's life. In her sphere, there was experiences that we can't relate to. And I think that's the issue some people have with it, that it can't be relatable because of her life, but it needs that, similar to H is for Hawk, it needs those moments to provide relief for that heavy grief she is experiencing. And it wasn't just the grief of her husband, her daughter was unwell, she was going through a lot in that year. And my recommendation is, if you have any interest in understanding the grieving process, then this is an essential book to read. It's not a very big book, you'll get through it very quickly, but I think it is important from that perspective. Another book I read just recently is The Burrow by Melanie, Cheng. And this is a fiction book. The only one on this list of books that is literary fiction. It's about the Lee family who are struggling through a shared grief in their family, but also they are in lockdown because of COVID in Melbourne. Amy is an author and a mother. Her husband, Jin, is an emergency doctor. They have a daughter, Lucy, who is 10 years old, and Amy's mother, Pauline, comes to live with them for a time because she's broken her arm. Pauline is clearly trying to make amends with Amy for some reason, and in such close quarters, the tension is really palpable as you start to realize that there's some shared experience they've had which has led to the death of somebody, and we kind of work through that with them. And amongst all this is this tiny little rabbit that they brought into their home during COVID, which becomes this central location for them to start to focus their love and affection when they can't give it to each other because of these buried secrets and emotions and tensions that they have. One of the things I found in my own journey is that not everyone grieves in the same way or for the same length of time. And this was a really interesting perspective because it's from 4 point of views, which is Amy, Jin, Lucy, Pauline, and even I think a chapter or two from the rabbit. But you get this unique 4 perspectives of people that have lost the same person, but they experience the grief very differently. And I think this book helped me have more empathy for that, to not try and put someone else's grieving process on my timeline. And if you know someone that has lost someone or something in their life and they just haven't pulled out of it, they haven't moved on, This was a great book to help stretch that muscle for empathy and compassion, to just be a good friend to that person and be there for them as they go through this, rather than try and change that and put it onto your own time frame. I was completely immersed in this book and I read it in about 24 hours. It's not a very big book at all. And Cheng's writing is really quite lyrical and atmospheric. And I really loved how she focuses on the small moments as well as the big moments. So there's these little underlying in-between moments that she brought into the story. It is a deeply driven character novel, and for me it was 5 stars. I think this was nominated for the Stella Prize this year. I think it's a wonderful book and I would highly recommend it. Again, give yourself some distance from these things if you need to, but as an overall recommendation. I really do think this is a topic I will keep seeking out in my books. Not a specific someone has died and this is their memoir, but the topic of grieving and processing that moment in your life. Because I truly feel that the more knowledge we have, the better we are. And then that leads to more empathy and compassion for other people. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we need to be gentle with ourselves as well. So I hope this was interesting for you, no matter what you are going through, if it is a loss of a person or a home or uncertainty in your life. These are some books that maybe just make a list of and come back to when you're ready for them. It is a process that only you know when you're ready to read these sort of books, but I do hope that you lean into books like I did, because they really do help with that process, and I will share more as I come to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for all of your support on this channel, for watching, for commenting and liking. I really appreciate it, and I will speak with you soon. Bye.